Now let's go and take a look at looking at pork cuts. So we take a look at pork. Again, they're cutability classes. So we have pork carcasses are cutability classes. There is one quality factor, which we'll talk about. And in several cases, there may be, well, if it's this, then you're going to have to put that one towards the bottom or at the bottom. And that is a case which we'll describe here in pork as well. So pork carcasses. So the good news on pork carcasses is because as it's split, you have windows, and fatness is a huge driver, even more than many other cuts. Fatness is a huge driver. So unless it's extremely light muscled, you're really going to be placing this on trimness first and then on muscling if it's in closed pairs. So all these different criteria as you look at them, generally when we rib a carcass, and the most important thing in valuing pork carcasses is back fat. So here's the back of the animal, and actually if the animal was standing up, this would be the top line. So the back of the animal. So we call this back fat. And in the industry, they use only this one measurement, the last rib back fat. Last rib back fats, if you take a look, are right there. That back fat, last rib, and the more that it has there, the lower the value of the carcass. We do look at, and originally the USDA grading system used three measurements: first rib, last rib, and last lumbar. So they would look and find the first rib and then measure the back fat opposite that. They'd find the last rib of the animal. This is the head would have been down here. It says jowl, so that's the face of the animal would have been down here. That's the front leg. So going up, this is the ham. This is the rear end of the animal. It's hanging by its Achilles tendon, or one of its tendons, again, gambrel tendon. So if you take a look at that, last rib fat, and then there's the lumbar vertebrae, and the last lumbar vertebrae, that's where we measure that fat. That gives us, if we make sure we look at those three locations, it really helps us. And then we also want to look at fat over the collar of the ham. We call that the ham collar, through the belly, and then down over the sternum. So those are fat factors. And that's really kind of the best part, is that we have windows. We have a window along the back, and we have a window through the cushion down the underneath on the belly side of that animal. And that window can give us a pretty good idea of total carcass fatness. So place them on trimness first. Those close in trimness, place them on muscling. If you happen to have one that's extremely light muscled, you place that's a muscle score of 1, which is pretty rare in our world. I've only seen that in about 4 different classes throughout my 35-year career. And that has happened, but it's extremely rare, and it's been in only about once or twice in a youth contest. I'm not saying it won't happen. It's just rare. And then questions, of course, may be asked on quality. So keep that in mind also for reasons as well. And we'll talk about what those factors are. Same criteria for a barrow, which is a male, as the pizzle, shape of the muscle. Same thing for gilt carcasses. We have both of those in the class. So place them on trimness first, close in trimness. Place them on marbling, or excuse me, place them on fat first, and then on close on fat, place them on muscling. So factors that we look at, okay, talked about for trimness. For muscling, again, we always start with the top when I look at from the rail side and work our way down. So we look at the same thing we talked about on a beef carcass for muscling. But in this case, we use different terms. We have the ham, we have the sirloin, we have the loin, we have the shoulder. We don't have a rib. Remember, there's no rib in pork carcasses. Keep that in mind. There are rib chops, but there's not the rib section. The loin goes all the way from the first to second rib, all the way to just before the H bone. So we have a shoulder. So again, let's take a look. Where do we look? If we had a rib carcass, which is pretty rare, we would use 10th rib back fats and loin eye area. Generally, we do that in the real world for the percent lean or percent muscle. But we have to use other indicators to give us an idea of percent lean, percent muscle. That's how pork carcasses are valued. And those indicators would be first rib, last rib, and last lumbar. We also look at the fat all the way along But looking at those three places are really helpful when you're assessing the trimness of a carcass. And then we look at the collar fat and the fat below. Okay, so we talked about that. We talked about the really light muscle one, and notice this, they're really rare to find these that are that light muscle. You know, most pigs nowadays are at least the three or greater. Occasionally you'll find one that's average muscling, but it's very difficult in today's world. Okay, so let's also with quality factors, there is one particular factor that we look at that will put a carcass or a cut down towards the bottom. All right, and so we'll explain that here in just a second. So color, marbling, texture, those are all important. The color for pork is not cherry red, that's beef. The color for pork is reddish pink, so keep that in mind. The last factor down here is exudation, which means watery. So we don't like watery. So watery is the amount of water that exudes from a cut or a carcass. And so this is a PSE. PSE stands for pale, soft, and exudative. Exudative means it exudes water. So we call that exudative instead of watery. So PSE, pale, soft, and exudative. You can see the water that dripped off of this loin chop, this one loin chop. That's the amount of water that came off that it lost. And this is RFN means red, red and normal, and DFD is dark cutters again. And that's really not a dark cutter in the real world as far as pork. But when we take a look at, this is another gradation. This you can get off the internet really easy. This chart, as far as the pictures, that'll help you as you prepare yourself. Okay, so we'll practice that in a minute. Let's go through the cuts, and then we'll go through whatever we have time for to look at some more classes. Hams, you know, in pork carcasses, PSE is not a factor. PSE goes to the bottom. Okay, generally, almost always will go to the bottom. Okay, in fact, it's always gone to the bottom in every class that I've ever looked at. I can imagine the case where there's an extremely fat ham that might not, PSE might go third, and you know, that's one of those I think has happened one time in my career, but it's almost always going to go to the bottom. So if you take a look at fresh hams and in a pork carcass, going back to that, you don't have a ribeye, so it's really tough to know whether carcass is PSE. If it is ribbed, then you have the loin eye, you can look at that PSE quality. But if it's not ribbed, you can't. But in hams, you have this butt face, and you can very easily tell whether that carcass is PSE. So the first question I always ask in a class before I place them on trim list, are there any of these that are PSE? And it will be obvious. As an official, I'm not going to make something that's kind of borderline and hear all the wrath of the coaches and the teachers. I'm going to make sure it's obvious. And so imagine a wet dish rag, kind of a dingy wet dish rag. That is kind of what a PSE is going to look like. I'll show you an example of one here in a minute. So if you take a look at this ham, you know, you're going to look at, is it PSE? If it is, it goes to the bottom. If it isn't, trim this first, close some trim this, place them on muscling. And so now we have these different characteristics. You know, you have the fat that's underneath the butt face, over the fork cushion, over the center section, just kind of like rounds. It kind of looks like a round because it is, though in pork, we call it a ham. Very similar criteria. You look for blueness and things like that when you look at trimness factors. So don't just face place, because you want to go around to the back. You want to look at that collar fat. That's really important. Collar fat, the fat over the fork cushion, as you look at that top cut here. So collar fat, fork cushion. Then also looking for blueness. You look through the skin. This actually has the skin still on it. And look for blueness in those cuts. In muscling, you look at the size of the butt face. Okay, we call it round face. In beef cattle, we call it pork. We call it the butt face. So we look at that size and shape and depth and width of that, just like we talked about in rounds. Then most important, and more importantly, you look at the center section. That's the most valuable part of a ham. Okay, and then, you know, so make sure you look at that length and width and depth and plumpness and bulgeness of that muscling when you're trying to evaluate muscling. Okay, then the last one before we look at a couple of classes is center cut loin evaluation. Okay, so in this one, we have two faces to look at, very similar to what we saw in the quality cuts, but this is not a quality cut. This is a cutability cut, only cutability for pork, okay, unless it's that PSE. So keep that in mind as you look at that PSE. First of all, question, I look at both faces, is this a PSE? It's not. So then I place them on trimness, and if they're close on trimness, I place them on muscling. So you do have two faces. You have the eye side of that, and you also have, might call it the sirloin face, might call it the loin end. Sometimes they'll call it the loin end. So again, you're looking at trimness over both of those, but you also have trimness over the back. So you look at the back fats along the edge. You also look at fat in the lower ribs and the loin edge region as well. And so similar to the other cuts that we talked about. Okay, muscling factors, you're going to look at the size of the loin eye. It's important to know the importance of the muscle. These other muscles around here are not very important. In fact, they're what I call neutral. I don't care if they're there or not. What I care about is how big this loin eye is. The loin eye on the other side, also called the top loin, part of the sirloin end, and then also this tenderloin or psoas major muscle, another thing to consider for muscling. Then you look at, again, the shape and the turn to the top. Remember, there's a round muscle that goes all the way throughout this cut. So the rounder it is, the more muscular, the flatter it is, the fatter and the lighter muscle it is. All right, so sirloin face. Here is PSE. Okay, and so it's just kind of, so you take a look at it. So that's what a PSE. If you see something that looks like that, it goes to the bottom. All right, now let's practice. Let's at least get one pork carcass class going. All right, here we go. Here's our 4. Okay, so take a look at these. Remember, trim this first, and we have this back. As we look through the back fat on this one, we're able to look across. We have a picture, a window. And then also we can see collar fat on these. Okay, so now, first thing is evaluate it. Which one's the trimmest? Which one's the fattest? Kind of from one to the other. Put a tentative placing down. Here's another angle that you can kind of also see fatness. Again, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's important. Again, what I always like to do is go from top to bottom and look at back fat. So I'll look at the last rib on each one. I'll look at the last rib on each one. I'll look at the shoulder first, about the first rib on each one. Remember, you want to look at all 3 of those because it may be fatter in one location, but not fatter in the other. So don't just let one point dominate that particular exhibit. And that's why they called that at one time average back fat, because they would take the average of those 3. And also you can see some collar fat on these as well. Okay, now here's where you're going to be able to evaluate actually one thing for fatness, because you look at shape of muscle, or excuse me, you look at muscling, you look at fatness. If it's really flat down its side, that's a pretty good indication that it's a fat carcass. And then also this is a place where you can really look at muscling differences through the ham, sirloin, particularly then also through the shoulder as well. Here's another view where you can see now the belly and the sternum. Again, always looking at the top. So I'll go collar, belly pockets, navel edge, belly, whatever you want to call that, and then the sternum. Go top to bottom on each one of these cuts. Be very systematic in that. However you do it, that's how I'd recommend, but be consistent. That way your eye's not jumping all over the place. All right, Lane and Kaylee, hopefully you're getting ready. All right, I want everybody to start putting their placings in the box. All right, everybody got their placings? All right, Kaylee and Lane, jump in here. Tell us what you think.
So for this class, we saw one pretty easily coming to the top. It's the trimmest, and it also is pretty heavy muscled when you saw it from the muscling view. And then from there, we thought that 2 went last because we thought that it was pretty much the fattest everywhere, except for 4 does have some fat building up in the clear plate towards the bottom of the carcass. And then we thought 3 went second because it was trimmer than 4. So we saw it as a top. 1 comes to the top because of the trimness, 2 falls to the bottom because it's the fattest, and then we kind of had a middle pair, but it was easily sortable because 3 was trimmer than 4.
Yep. All right. Hey, good. So let's take a look. So as you take a look at it, really, it is a 2-pair class. There is trim. Trim this first. You know, you 1, 3, 2, 4. What ends up happening if you're not careful is that you're going to zero in. When you look at it, you're going to zero in on this one. And 2 and 4 are really, in my mind, really close. And so as I looked at that, I was really thinking about putting 3 over 4. So my thought is let's kind of look at it first. So we look at overall fat. Overall fat number 1, okay, is the trimmest. So that's pretty easy. Number 3 is next. Okay, and I see all this fat over the shoulder on number 4. You know, as I take a look at that, and I think, wow, you know, that's a lot. But then I start looking at other places. So let's ask yourself the question, which one's trimmer over the last rib? And remember, in the industry, that's the measurement that they would take, the only one they take. And there's no doubt that 4 is trimmer. Okay, which one's trimmer over the last lumbar? Okay, no doubt that 4 again is trimmer. So there's no doubt that number 2 is trimmer over the first rib, but the advantage. So I'm going to have to look at the other places. So again, stepping on this view and other views, you know, 1 and 3 are close, 2 and 4 are close. All right, so let's take a look at this view. Actually, let's go back just a hair. Let's go to, let's look at fats and trimness at this level, because I want to get that, really nail that one down. So if we look at 1 versus 3, so which one is trimmer over the ham collar? Well, 3 is. Which one's trimmer over the belly? Okay, well, 1 is. Which one's trimmer over the sternum? A little hard to see, but they're about the same. So that didn't help me a whole lot, although I know that 1 is trimmer and back fat, so I'm going to go leaning that way pretty heavily. So then I have 2 over 4. So which one's trimmer over the collar? Well, 4 is. Which one's trimmer over the belly? 4 is. Which one's much trimmer over the sternum? 4. So now 4 comes to the top over 2. Okay, it doesn't make it better than 3 or 1, that's for sure, but that's how I'm going to place those 2. And then finally, I'm going to look at muscling. So let's get to that picture, muscling. Wow, when I see 2 and it looks this straight-sided, that tells me that 2 is really fat. So I'm going to put 2 on the bottom, even though I know that 4 has more fat over that first rib. Okay, but if I look at muscle shape between 2 and 4, no doubt that 4 has a more shapely. Okay, and then I'm going to look at the muscularity of 3 over 1. So I've got to ask myself a question. Is the trimness difference, because I believe 3 is heavier muscle. So is there enough trimness difference for me to place 1/3? If I think they're close in trimness, then what do? I place them on muscling. Okay, if I think that there's enough trimness differences, okay, so then I'm going to come back to that view and say, okay, is there enough trimness differences to really make that muscling advantage that 3 has? Because if it's much trimmer, I'm going to have to go with 1/3. If they're close, then I'm going to have to go. So now I'm going to look at trimness one more time. So I look at the last rib. Which one's trimmer? Well, number 3 is trimmer. Which one's trimmer? Excuse me, last lumbar. Which one's trimmer? Number 3. Last rib. They're actually pretty close. If we look at over the shoulder, no doubt that 1 is the trimmest. Ham collar, probably going to go to 3, but look at the belly difference, particularly this belly pocket. Oh, excuse me, ham collar goes to 3, belly pocket goes to 1. I'm thinking now they're pretty close. So guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to go against the tide and I'm going to place it 3/1 and make everybody in the contest except for Casey mad at me. Okay, but that's kind of how I would go. But I do make Casey mad at me because I went 4/2. But I'm being fairly consistent in my thought process. I'm looking at trimness. If they're close in trimness, I place them on muscling, and that really fits that pattern on both sides.